The base was not lightly defended. It had layered security, perimeter surveillance, hardened command structures, and enough manpower to repel conventional assault. On paper, it was insulated from surprise. 30 operators were not supposed to threaten something built to withstand battalion-level pressure, yet the operation would later be summarized in 2 words spoken quietly during debrief: game over. Not because the base was destroyed, not because it was captured permanently, but because for a controlled window of time it was rendered operationally blind, internally fragmented, and strategically outplayed by a force 1 fraction its size. The difference was not strength, it was sequencing. The SAS did not approach the objective as a frontal contest. They approached it as a system to be disassembled. Before insertion, they spent weeks mapping routine rather than defenses. Guard rotations were predictable within narrow variance bands. Maintenance crews accessed secondary gates during specific logistical windows. Communications checks followed standardized hourly pulses. Drone overwatch patterns overlapped at consistent altitudes, creating brief but measurable coverage gaps at transitional arcs. None of these were weaknesses individually. Together, they formed rhythm, and rhythm can be studied. The base believed its security layers were redundant. In reality, they were synchronized. Synchronization creates efficiency. It also creates dependency. The SAS objective was not to overpower the perimeter, it was to desynchronize it. Insertion occurred not at the strongest point, but at the most routine one, a maintenance corridor whose security confidence had been reinforced by months of uneventful use. There was no explosion, no dramatic breach. Entry exploited assumption, not force. Once inside the outer layer, the operation divided into autonomous cells with distinct micro-objectives: disrupt internal communications without triggering full lockdown protocols, isolate rapid response units through corridor misdirection, and create the illusion of a larger internal presence than actually existed. Timing was exact. A controlled interference spike coincided with a scheduled systems diagnostic, masking the anomaly. Simultaneously, secondary access doors were sealed from within, not to trap defenders, but to fragment their movement. The base reacted as designed, initiating compartmentalized containment. That reaction was anticipated. Compartmentalization slowed its own response speed. By the time Command realized the intrusion was coordinated rather than incidental, the SAS had already penetrated to critical nodes, not to destroy them permanently, but to demonstrate access. Secure terminals were reached. Surveillance feeds were temporarily looped. Command corridors were navigated without sustained resistance. The objective was psychological as much as tactical: prove vulnerability. Within less than an hour, the base's internal command structure operated on partial information. Reports conflicted. Response teams moved toward false indicators, triggered intentionally to simulate multiple breach points. 30 operators created the perception of a much larger force by manipulating reaction channels rather than engaging directly. No prolonged firefight defined the operation. Instead, defenders found themselves responding to echoes, doors sealed without visible attackers, systems flickering at precise intervals, shadow movements that dissolved before engagement. When extraction commenced, it did so before full consolidation of defense could occur. The base remained standing, its manpower intact, its infrastructure largely undamaged, yet the message was irreversible. Security had been penetrated not through brute force, but through comprehension of its internal logic. Game over did not signify destruction, it signified checkmate, a moment when the larger force realized the smaller one had been thinking 3 moves ahead from the beginning. What followed mattered more than the breach itself. The base command initially framed the event as a contained incursion, a limited penetration exploited under rare alignment of variables. That explanation lasted until the internal audit began. Sensor logs were reconstructed, movement timelines were overlaid, communication transcripts were replayed without redaction. A pattern emerged that was difficult to ignore. Every defensive response had been predicted within a margin of seconds. Rapid reaction teams mobilized exactly where false indicators directed them. Internal lockdown protocols isolated sections that did not contain intruders while leaving actual access corridors fluid for just long enough. The defenders had not been overwhelmed, they had been steered. This distinction shifted the tone of analysis. The SAS had not attacked the strongest layer, they had forced the base to activate its own complexity against itself. Redundant security measures designed to increase resilience created procedural delays when triggered simultaneously. Each additional safeguard required confirmation, each confirmation required communication, and each communication created time. Time was the only resource the 30 operators needed. The operational debrief revealed that only a fraction of the team had direct contact with core infrastructure. The majority functioned as environmental architects, controlling light exposure, sound signatures, and movement traces to shape defender perception. Footsteps were allowed to be heard in one corridor, while actual movement occurred in another. Minor system disruptions were introduced deliberately to escalate uncertainty, but remain below full threat thresholds. The base never fully committed to one interpretation of the threat. It oscillated. Oscillation is paralysis in slow motion. By the 30-minute mark, defenders were no longer asking where the intruders were. They were asking how many there were. That question alone indicated strategic success. The illusion of scale amplified pressure on command decisions. More personnel were allocated to containment than necessary. Patrol density increased unevenly, thinning coverage in peripheral zones. The SAS exploited that redistribution without accelerating tempo. They maintained calm pacing, preserving energy and clarity. When secure documentation nodes were accessed, the operators did not extract sensitive material. They marked presence. A temporary override message was inserted into a non-critical administrative channel. Brief, untraceable, unmistakable, access achieved. It was not theatrical, it was deliberate proof. The base leadership later acknowledged privately that the psychological impact exceeded the physical intrusion. Infrastructure could be reinforced, protocols could be rewritten. But the demonstration had exposed an uncomfortable truth. Structural strength does not compensate for cognitive predictability. In post-operation simulations, attempts were made to replicate the breach under revised conditions. Results varied, but one constant remained. The defenders had to simplify their own procedures to reduce exploitable rhythm. Simplification reduced efficiency. Efficiency had once been their advantage. The SAS operation forced a trade-off. 30 operators did not defeat an entire base through firepower. They imposed doubt, and doubt altered doctrine. The phrase "game over" circulated not as exaggeration, but as acknowledgement that the contest had been decided before the first perimeter sensor flickered. The maneuver was not physical dominance. It was intellectual superiority applied with surgical restraint. The strategic consequences extended beyond that single installation. Training reviews across Allied units quietly integrated one uncomfortable lesson. Scale creates inertia. The larger the defensive structure, the more it depends on predictable coordination. Predictability is efficient. It is also readable. The SAS had demonstrated that a smaller force, if disciplined enough to study rhythm instead of walls, could turn coordination into exposure. In subsequent joint exercises, scenarios were redesigned to test cognitive elasticity rather than perimeter hardness. Commanders were instructed to randomize patrol logic, decentralize confirmation chains, and reduce synchronized response triggers. None of those changes were publicized as direct reactions, but inside professional circles the reference point was understood. The operation became a case study not in aggression, but in cognitive warfare. Analysts later dissected the timeline down to seconds. The insertion window was chosen not merely for environmental cover, but for administrative fatigue, mid-cycle between shift transitions when alertness dips, but procedures remain formally active. Lighting systems inside the base were exploited through shadow mapping conducted weeks earlier via satellite modeling and environmental scans. Even ambient noise from ventilation units had been measured to mask micro-movements. Nothing about the breach relied on improvisation. Improvisation is reactive. This was architectural. Each operator understood not only his task, but the projected reaction it would trigger. That level of anticipatory synchronization within a 30-person unit allowed them to move without visible communication once inside. Hand signals were minimal. Radio silence was maintained longer than defenders believed possible. When the base finally consolidated a coherent internal picture, the SAS had already transitioned into extraction posture. No chaotic retreat followed. Exit routes were staggered to avoid pattern repetition. Tracking drones launched too late to intercept meaningful contact. From a purely material standpoint, losses were negligible on both sides. From a doctrinal standpoint, The shift was significant. The base command's after-action report contained a line that rarely appears in formal military language. We reacted exactly as designed. It was not praise, it was recognition that design itself had been studied and neutralized. 30 operators did not need to hold territory to win. They needed to expose that control was conditional. Once that understanding settled into the defensive command structure, every future alert carried an additional variable, uncertainty about whether the reaction itself was being manipulated. That lingering hesitation is operational drag, and operational drag accumulates over time. The phrase "game over" endured because it captured the asymmetry of the moment. The contest was not decided at the perimeter, it was decided during months of observation, modeling, and psychological framing long before boots crossed the threshold. By the time the base understood the nature of the game, it had already been playing by rules written elsewhere. In the months that followed, the narrative shifted from incident to doctrine. Quiet briefings circulated among senior planners outlining a simple but unsettling premise. Superiority measured in numbers or fortification depth does not equal control of initiative. Initiative belongs to the side that defines tempo. During the operation, the base believed it was accelerating response. In reality, it was accelerating into pre-structured corridors of decision. Every escalation step had been forecast. Every containment measure had been gamed in simulation environments long before execution night. The SAS did not rely on probability. They reduced variables until defender choice collapsed into a narrow band of predictable actions. That is the hidden leverage of disciplined small units. They do not need to dominate space if they can dominate interpretation. When internal transcripts were reviewed again at higher command levels, one moment stood out. A senior officer asked over secure line, "Do we know their objective?" The answer came after a pause. "Not yet." That pause represented the entire operation. For 47 minutes, a heavily defended installation could not define the enemy's intent. Without intent clarity, force allocation becomes cautious. Caution fragments strength. By the time clarity approached, the window was closing. Extraction occurred with surgical timing, neither rushed nor prolonged. No symbolic destruction marked the exit. The message had already been delivered. Subsequent cross-force exercises attempted to replicate the psychological dimension of the breach. Many failed because they focused on tactics rather than cognition. The essence was not stealth alone, it was controlled ambiguity. The defenders were not overwhelmed by action, they were saturated with partial signals. Partial signals demand analysis. Analysis consumes time, time shifts balance. Internally, the SAS evaluation framed the mission not as triumph but as validation of methodology. Study the system, identify rhythm, disrupt rhythm, exit before adaptation stabilizes. There was no need for spectacle. Precision carries its own weight. Years later, when the operation was referenced in closed seminars, instructors emphasized one line. A base can be fortified against assault, but it is rarely fortified against understanding. That distinction defines modern asymmetry. The phrase "game over" survived because it captured the moment defenders realized that strength without adaptive unpredictability becomes a pattern, and patterns can be solved. 30 operators did not defeat an entire base by force of arms. They ended the contest by proving the larger structure had been analyzed more thoroughly by outsiders than by those who built it. And once that realization takes hold inside command culture, every alarm sounds slightly different, not louder, just uncertain. What made the operation enduring was not the breach itself, but the silence that followed in official channels. There was no dramatic press cycle, no public reprimand, no visible restructuring. On the surface, procedures continued as normal, but internally planning rooms changed tone. Commanders began asking different questions during security reviews. Not, "Is it strong enough?" but "Is it predictable?" That shift seems subtle. It is not. Strength can be increased with resources. Predictability requires humility to dismantle. The base that had been outmaneuvered invested in thicker perimeters, expanded drone grids, and additional personnel layers. Yet none of those measures addressed the core exposure revealed that night. Synchronized systems create exploitable cadence. When cadence becomes doctrine, doctrine becomes readable. The SAS did not invent that principle. They operationalized it with restraint. In private reflections from participants, one theme recurred: discipline under low visibility. There was no adrenaline-driven firefight to anchor memory, no explosive climax. Instead, the defining sensation was control. Each operator moved within a mental map that extended beyond walls into anticipated reactions. They were not navigating a structure, they were navigating decision trees. That distinction is why 30 individuals could alter the confidence of an entire installation without occupying it. The defenders, once they reconstructed the timeline, confronted a more uncomfortable conclusion. At no single moment did they face overwhelming force. At every moment, they faced uncertainty calibrated to remain just below decisive clarity. It is difficult to counter what you cannot confidently define. The legacy of the operation therefore settled not in medals or headlines, but in quiet adaptation. Training programs began inserting deliberate irregularity into routines. Artificial randomness was introduced into patrol timing. Command chains were compressed to reduce confirmation delay. Yet artificial randomness is still structured, and structured randomness can be studied. That paradox lingers. The phrase "game over" was never meant as arrogance. It was diagnostic. It marked the instant a larger system recognized it had been solved like a problem set. In strategic competition, being solved is more damaging than being struck. Strikes can be absorbed, solutions dismantle advantage. The 30 who executed the maneuver did not change the balance of power through destruction. They changed it through demonstration. They showed that mastery in modern conflict often belongs to those who observe longer than they engage, who map cognition before movement, who treat defenses not as barriers, but as algorithms. Once that framework becomes visible, every fortified base carries a hidden question inside its walls. Who has already studied us? And that question, persistent and unanswerable, is the quiet aftermath of that night. Over time, the story stopped being about 30 operators and started being about scale versus precision. Large institutions prefer measurable metrics: troop numbers, surveillance density, structural reinforcement. Those metrics reassure leadership because they are visible. What the operation exposed was something harder to quantify: cognitive surface area. The bigger the structure, the more assumptions it must standardize to function smoothly. Standardization enables coordination. But coordination depends on shared expectations. Shared expectations, once identified, become levers. The SAS did not overpower resistance. They located levers embedded in routine. In post-incident modeling, analysts attempted to calculate the probability of recurrence. The numbers varied, but the conclusion was consistent. The breach window existed because the base trusted its own efficiency. Efficiency reduces friction. Friction sometimes protects. When every response pathway is optimized for speed and clarity, it can be guided if someone understands its design logic. That realization forced a philosophical shift more than a tactical one. Defense planners began discussing adaptive opacity, deliberately obscuring internal patterns even from their own personnel to reduce external readability. But opacity introduces confusion internally. Confusion reduces cohesion. The trade-off became unavoidable: clarity for insiders versus ambiguity for outsiders. The operation had turned that balance into a strategic dilemma. For the SAS, the lesson reinforced a long-held principle: small units achieve disproportionate effect when they treat environment as an extension of planning, not as an obstacle. Months of observation mattered more than minutes of contact. Patience created leverage. The actual night of execution was merely confirmation. When historians later dissected similar asymmetric operations, this one stood out for its restraint. There was no dramatic casualty count, no catastrophic infrastructure loss. Its impact was conceptual. It demonstrated that dominance in modern conflict is less about territory seized and more about perception shaped. When a fortified installation questions its own reaction time, its own clarity, its own structural logic, a subtle erosion begins. Not panic, not collapse, erosion. And erosion accumulates invisibly. Game over endured because it summarized that quiet tipping point, the second when defenders realized they had been responding inside a framework someone else authored. From that moment forward, every drill, every alarm, every protocol revision carried the memory of having once been anticipated. An anticipation, once proven possible, can never be fully erased. Eventually, the operation settled into doctrine not as legend, but as warning. In closed strategic forums, it was referenced less for what happened and more for what it implied. If 30 operators could map, predict, and manipulate a fortified installation without triggering catastrophic confrontation, then the battlefield had shifted decisively toward cognition. Firepower remained relevant, fortifications remained necessary, but neither guaranteed initiative. Initiative belonged to the side that understood systemic behavior at a deeper layer than the architects themselves. The base recovered structurally within weeks. Confidence took longer, not because leadership doubted their personnel, but because they now understood exposure was not a matter of negligence. It was structural transparency. Large systems must communicate internally to function. Communication leaves patterns. Patterns reveal tempo. Tempo can be measured. Measured tempo can be disrupted. The simplicity of that chain was what unsettled planners. In subsequent multinational exercises, a new emphasis appeared: counter-predictive training. Units were instructed to design operations that intentionally broke their own habits. Patrol leaders rotated decision authority mid-cycle. Simulation cells introduced false internal signals to test response discipline. The goal was not chaos but elasticity. Elastic systems bend without revealing consistent rhythm. Yet elasticity requires cultural tolerance for uncertainty. Not all institutions adapt easily to that. For the SAS, the mission reinforced identity rather than redefining it. Small footprint, deep study, limited exposure, controlled exit. No need for spectacle. The success metric was not territory held, but equilibrium shifted. Years later, when junior officers asked veterans what truly decided the outcome, the answer was rarely about entry routes or equipment. It was about time spent observing before acting, the quiet hours. The patience to wait for patterns to stabilize before moving against them. In that sense, game over was less a declaration of victory and more a statement about preparation. The contest had ended before it visibly began. By the time defenders realized they were engaged in a strategic exchange, the decisive moves had already been executed in silence. That is the enduring lesson. In modern conflict, visibility often marks the midpoint, not the start. And when a larger force discovers it has been studied more thoroughly than it studied itself, the psychological balance shifts permanently. The base still stands, the personnel still train, the perimeter is stronger than before, but somewhere in every subsequent briefing, an unspoken awareness remains that strength without unpredictability is simply a solved equation waiting to be tested again. In the end, what defined the operation was not disruption, not excess, not even the flawless extraction. It was the recalibration of perspective. The base had believed security was a matter of accumulation, more sensors, more layers, more protocols. The SAS approached it as a matter of interpretation. They treated the installation not as a fortress, but as a living system governed by habit. Habits create comfort. Comfort creates rhythm. Rhythm, once mapped, becomes vulnerable to interruption. The 30 operators never needed to dominate the structure physically because they had already positioned themselves above it cognitively. That is why no dramatic firefight was necessary to cement the result. The moment command realized their responses had been anticipated in sequence, the operational contest effectively closed. Game over was not shouted, it was understood. It captured the quiet recognition that superiority in numbers cannot compensate for intellectual exposure. In private assessments, senior planners conceded that the most unsettling element was not how the breach occurred, but how calmly it unfolded. There was no visible rush, no desperate improvisation. Every movement suggested prior familiarity with reaction pathways. That familiarity implied study, and study implies time. The realization that an external force had invested that level of attention into dissecting internal logic reshaped defensive philosophy more than any material loss could have. From that point forward, the installation's strength was measured not only in steel and manpower, but in adaptability. Protocols were rewritten to inject irregularity. Decision chains were shortened to reduce exploitable delay. Training cycles emphasized cognitive flexibility alongside physical readiness. Yet the underlying truth remained. Any system large enough to defend must also coordinate, and coordination inevitably forms patterns. The operation became a quiet benchmark in asymmetric doctrine because it illustrated a principle with surgical clarity. Control belongs to those who define tempo, not those who merely respond to it. 30 operators did not conquer territory, they altered confidence. They demonstrated that dominance is not always loud, and victory is not always visible. Sometimes it is the silent awareness, settling in after the lights stabilize and the corridors clear, that something fundamental has shifted. The perimeter stands, the base functions. But the memory endures of a night when structure met strategy and discovered that it had been outthought. That was the real conclusion. Not destruction, not humiliation. Just a precise demonstration that in modern conflict, understanding the system is often enough to end the game before it appears to begin.